EQ first, compression first? That is the question. Hi, welcome to the Quakes Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, I want to look at one of the questions I get asked the most from students, and that is, do I EQ first or do I compress first? Now, the simple answer is there is no simple answer. There is no right or wrong, and you shouldn't do anything by default. But what I want to look at today are situations where you would EQ first, or where you might decide to EQ first, or you might decide to compress first. Again, like I said, there's no right or wrong answer. But what I want you to do is really think about what you want from the source. Do you want to change its tone? Do you want to change the transients? Do you want to change the way it sits in the mix? And once you've made that assessment, then it's a lot easier to decide whether you want to EQ or compress first. Let's jump in. So here we are in Studio One. Now, again, I just want to stress there is no right or wrong answer here. I'm just going to run through some situations where I've made an assessment, and because of that assessment, I've made the decision on whether I wanted to EQ first or compress first. It's just really to give you some examples that might give you some inspiration. And again, I want to stress that you need to get into the habit of listening to your source, deciding what you want to do with that source, almost like hearing ahead, almost like chess, thinking moves ahead, how you want that sound to be, how you want its tone to be, how you want its transients to be, and then use the EQ and the compression in tandem to shape that sound, to control the levels of that sound, to control the tone of that sound. So make that assessment first. So starting with this situation, I have a pre-master here, and I listen to it I have an assessing session when I do masters. So I'll sit down and listen to the music that I'm going to be mastering that day, and I'll make notes. And with this track, I'm just going to run through it very quickly. I'm not going to go through the whole mastering process, but I basically decided that I needed to do a bit of subtractive EQ to take care of a few frequencies. Then I was going to compress it just to kind of control the peaks. And then I wanted to add a bit of character to it with a broad stroke EQ, which is probably going to be something like Bettermaker or the Pultec, probably Bettermaker actually, because I wanted to adjust kind of the 5K region as well, and it's not so easy doing that with just a straight Pultec. So with subtractive EQ, I would use something digital that doesn't really imprint a sound, linear phase most of the time, but again, there's no default. I would try things out, but in this situation, I'm going to use linear phase. Going to take a bit of the low end off. Going to take some of the low end off on the sides as well. And then there are a few frequencies around here that I noticed that were maybe causing some issues. So quickly there, I've just applied some dynamic EQ to that, and that's just going to take out those resonant frequencies when they're actually there. It's not really going to affect the overall sound. So that's just what I would call some very quick surgical EQ. It's not 100% right. I just wanted to run through it quickly. Then I would use a mastering compressor, bus style compressor. We'll use Unisum here, one of my favorite mastering compressors. I did actually set up a preset for this earlier. Okay, so some very gentle compression, low ratio, 75 milliseconds release. Just squashing things a little bit, adding a little bit of glue, having the side chain up quite high so that the bottom end is not affecting the compressor at all. So what it's doing by doing that for me is it's gluing things, but it's taking the body of the vocals and just sort of compressing them into the mix, just gluing them into the mix a little bit more. So very, very light compression, really. You know, it's not even over a dB of gain reduction, really. And this compressor, if I use this here, does actually imprint a little bit of character as well, a bit of saturation. Demo this compressor, honestly, it's absolutely amazing. I absolutely love it. There's quite a lot to it, quite a big learning curve, but it's amazing. So that for me just warms things up and has just glued things a little bit. So now I feel like I need a bit of brightness. As I expected, this does tend to kind of not dull things, but warm things up a little bit in a really, really nice way. But I just want to bring back a little bit of clarity and a little bit of top end. So I'm going to use the Bettermaker. So there you go, very, very quickly. So in this situation, I decided I needed to EQ first, then compress, and then add some color EQ afterwards. So in this situation, I have a lead vocal. Love me or hate me. And I've decided again, I want to do just a little bit of subtractive EQ. Love me or hate me. Just rolled off the bottom there. This can quite often be to roll off rumbles on microphones, but really just listen to the sound first, decide, does that low end information need to be there? Do I just want to clean it up? Love me or hate, love me or hate, love me or hate. It just cleans it up basically, just a stock EQ from Studio One. And then I just want to catch the peaks. Love me or hate me. Love me or hate me. Listen to when she says hate without the compressor. Love me or hate. And then with the compressor. Love me or hate me. Just evens it out. It's just taken the peaks off a little bit and just leveled it out. And also what's nice is it's kind of brought up a little bit of the room as well and made her sound nice and breathy, that really sort of upfront pop sound. Love me or hate me. Love me or hate me. So a little bit of subtraction, EQ, a little bit of leveling, or just, sorry, taking the peaks off. And then I would probably use LA2A just to even it out. Love me or hate me. Love me. Let's just take the take that down a little bit. Love me or hate me. So here's with. Love me or hate me. Love me or hate me. So what it's done there is got rid of the rubbish, caught the peaks, and then just evened it out nicely and added a nice bit of character. But so far, the pattern that you're seeing is I'm using subtractive EQ to get rid of stuff that I don't want, and compressors to affect the transient or control the levels of the source. And then, if need be, use some more EQ to add some tone or maybe add some body into it. Or, you know, once I've leveled everything out, the compressor may have affected the tone of the actual source. So you'll use the color EQ to bring back the tones in the actual source. Now, in what situation would I compress first? Nowadays, because working in the box, we have so many options, that we can just have a little bit of subtractive EQ before we compress, etc. You will see me personally, I do tend to EQ before I compress, because it's so easy to do it. But when we were working with outboard equipment, it was a bit of a pain to have an EQ and then a compressor and then another EQ and then maybe another compressor. You know, it was harder to do because you had to patch everything in. Nowadays, it's a lot easier to just have an EQ just like taking out a resonant frequency, or an EQ just boosting 5K. So we do. I don't want to say, because I did say don't do anything by default, but just generally, yeah, I think generally I do tend to EQ in a subtractive way to clean up stuff first before I compress. But there are situations where I don't. One of the major situations where I will compress first, almost all of the time, but again, not by default, is drum buses or sampled beats, that kind of thing. Because what I quite often want to do is, especially if I want to inject some movement into the drum beat. So what I will do is I will parallel compress, without touching any EQ whatsoever first, unless obviously there's some really, really major problems. But generally on a drum bus, I will compress, with something like an API 2500 or a G-Bus SSL or Alpha compressor from Alicia, that kind of compression where I will inject. I'll probably do quite a lot of compression, quite heavy compression, but I will use it in parallel. So what it does is it introduces movement into the drum beat. Then I will start EQing. So let's just show you what I mean. So let's take a G-Bus. So if you listen to it in bypass, just as it is raw, listen to the snares and try and listen to the gaps, the parts in between where the room is coming through. Obviously that's a sampled beat and I don't have access to the individual parts. So what I've done with the compressor is, if you listen to the snares especially, I've glued it all in, made it sit together a little bit more. But by adding a lot of compression so that the compressor's been hit quite hard, it's almost creating a bit of a pumping sound. But then I've parallel compressed, so I've pulled it back a little bit. So it's introduced that movement, but it's not too pumpy. Then I would add some EQ, something broad, Pultec. So that's just given it some weight and added some sparkle up top. I've been quite heavy with it here, but you can be with the Pultec. It's quite a broad stroke EQ. So there's a situation where I would have compression first and then EQ. And finally, another situation where I may compress before I EQ would weirdly enough be on the mix bus. Now I have actually done previous videos about my mix bus process, and what I quite often do is I will put a compressor over the mix bus very early on and mix into the compressor, and also to give the whole the whole track a kind of broad sound, a broad tone, I will add some EQ. So that will be compression into EQ on the mix bus. So again, let's go for something like the G bus. And something like Bettermaker. Let's just have the Bettermaker off for the moment. And with the G bus, I'm just going to do, it's light compression, and it is just going to be something that I would mix into. And obviously this is a pre-master here, it isn't an actual track, but I think I can show you what I would do, what I mean by this. So very light compression. Sidechain very high, so I don't want the bottom end affecting the compressor at all. So it's a tiny bit of glue. Just some cohesion really, and then a broad stroke EQ after the compressor. So as you can hear, they're quite subtle. You want to be subtle on the mix bus. It's light mastering. But what I have done with this EQ after the compressor, so glued everything nicely with the compressor, and I would mix into that compressor. This would happen very, very early on in my mix bus chain. I guess what I've done is I've simulated the sound of a console, and I used to use an SSL console a lot, so I do like to use the G bus a lot on the mix bus and mix into it because that's what I was used to. And then kind of create a wide, very broad stroke tone to the entire mix. Here I've just given it a bit of bottom end, around about 60 Hertz, bit of top end, a bit of clarity at 5K, and just dipped where the mud would be. And you know, this is not necessarily how the EQ would end up, but it'd be something that I'd mix into and I would adjust as I go, as I would bring in more instruments. Obviously in this situation, I'm simulating that I've got a whole mix, but you can hear the subtlety, what it does by just having the compressor first to glue it and then the EQ afterwards to give it a broad sort of tone. There is a tiny bit of difference in level, so don't be fooled by that. So listen to the transients, listen to the way the mix sits, and listen to the overall tone. So there you have it, some very, very quick examples of me taking a source, assessing the source, deciding what I want to do with it, how I want it to sound, and then I make the decision on whether I should EQ first or compress first. If you get into the habit of doing that, you won't have to ask the question anymore, do I EQ first or do I compress first? And you'll be able to tell other people that there is no right or wrong answer, just assess, decide where you want it to go, and then it's done for you. You'll know whether to EQ first or you'll know whether to compress first. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing and mastering tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.